again, and glad you're here. Hope you had a wonderful day today. If not today, let's make tomorrow a wonderful day. Each one is special, don't forget that. It's an anniversary of sorts. Well, it is an anniversary. March 13th. That many years ago? Gee. All right. We call them the Phoenix Lights. Maybe the second or third largest mass multiple UFO sighting on record. Certainly one of the biggies. My mind always goes back to February 1942 and the Battle of Los Angeles, in which perhaps 500,000 people watched a UFO fired upon hundreds and hundreds of times by anti-aircraft batteries at the height of World War II paranoia. But the Phoenix Lights were something else. There were a number of items up in the sky, apparently, sighted over a period of hours, not only in the Phoenix area, but many areas of Arizona. One of the key researchers who jumped in with both feet and has been researching it ever since is Bill Hamilton, a longtime friend of ours and this program's. Bill of Skywatch International is back with us tonight to talk about this and what we have learned lately. Bill Hamilton, by the way, in case you don't know, had the great privilege as a young UFO enthusiast, I guess he was 10 or 12 years of age, to attend many of the giant rock functions in the Mojave Desert in California, put on by George Van Tassel. He got to meet all of them, Adamski and the rest of them. Welcome back, William. How are you?
I'm fine, Jeff.
Glad to talk to you again. How old were you when Giant Rock was going on?
Well, I first went to Giant Rock when I was 14 years old and made several visits out there and became friends with George Van Tassel and several other people who lived out there, and had some very interesting conversations.
Well, we've talked about some of those in the past. Yeah, when you were 14 years old, did your friends share your interest, your age group peers in UFOs?
I did have one friend from school who shared my interest, and
otherwise, did you keep it sort of quiet, or did you talk about it much?
Somewhat, yes. I didn't talk about it a lot. There was a kind of air of ridicule that existed then. It still exists today. But there's a lot less ridicule today than there was.
Yeah. Well, this is in the 1950s, and boy, the great classic Hollywood UFO movies were coming fast and furiously across the nation's screens and all that.
Fantastic movies.
They were the greatest, I think, given what was in them back then. It's almost as if somebody knew something.
I know. In fact, one of my favorites back then was one of the first science fiction movies in CinemaScope in Technicolor called Forbidden Planet. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I've just got it on video. That's absolutely one of the greatest.
And of course, one of the first things you see on the screen is a flying saucer moving through space, and it just blew me out of the chair.
One of the second things you see is a young, dapper Leslie Nielsen.
Oh, yes. And not being bumbling around either.
No, he was the man in charge.
Yeah.
Got the girl and got the robot and got the heck out of there just in time.
Oh, yes.
A great film.
Yes, it was. Okay.
The questions that confronted you and George Van Tassel, of course, they didn't really bother Van Tassel because he knew. George Adamski knew. Most of the people you were hanging around with knew of the reality of all of this. But those questions, in a sense, remain with us today. Are you personally, Bill, happy about the progress you have made toward unraveling the mystery? Have you made as much progress as you thought you might in the intervening decades that have passed?
No, Jeff, absolutely not. In my mind, when I was a teenager, and I sighted these objects myself, along with many newfound friends at that time. And, of course, our favorite viewing spot was in the desert. And I thought it was all going to be very simple, that the answer to the UFO mystery was that these were friendly visitors coming here in their spacecraft, and some of them were landing and getting out and even shaking hands with people, and it wouldn't be long before I would get the opportunity to do the same, maybe even take a ride, which was something that excited me quite a bit back then. And kind of, you might say, as an offshoot of all of that, it stimulated my interest in astronomy, in space travel, in the sciences, so that I was determined to study these subjects and learn more about these visitors. But as the years have gone by, of course, the UFO mystery, instead of becoming simpler and unraveling, has become more complex. And
is it off the wall to suggest, just for the sake of discussion, that perhaps the visitors in the 1950s were maybe fewer in different types, and maybe they were more benign than some of the later arrivals from out there? And I'm speaking of the contactee, the age of the contactee, the era of the contactee. These were benign incidences.
Yes.
The reports spoke of nothing untoward. They didn't talk about the abduction phenomenon and implants and skin samples and all the rest of it that we know about now. That wasn't discussed back then.
We had never heard of a missing time. We had never heard of the word abduction by any of these visitors.
So
it was always a contact, a friendly contact that was made.
Right. Well, but fantastic. And Adamski, do you think that may be a viable proposition I've put out there, that other types have either come back again or come here for the first time and are doing things that those visitors in the 50s, maybe late 40s, weren't doing?
Well, it definitely, the appearance of these other visitors and their modes of operation, their behavior is entirely different from that we knew in the 50s. And of course, we didn't have UFO organizations around. We didn't have UFO field investigators. We had one group that I know about, which was NICAP. And NICAP virtually ignored the contactee phenomena. And they kind of established the idea that people who claimed the type of contact that George Adamski claimed, for instance, were just a number of kooks, mainly who lived out west and in kooky California, right?
In the great Southwest.
But here I was in touch with these people and several other people that were not known because they never wrote a book, they never lectured from a platform, but they had stories to tell too, and their stories were very, very similar in those days. It was just like there were hundreds of people having these type of contact experiences in those days, and the visitors were telling them evidently that they were coming from planets in our own solar system. Today, of course, we don't see any cities on Mars or anything like that, so we poo-poo the whole idea. Well, these people must have just been fabricating these stories, but that's not necessarily the case.
No.
So that mystery may never be resolved unless whoever those visitors were, who were here, who made those contacts, and then mysteriously seemed to withdraw and leave.
Indeed, they did.
Unless they return someday and explain who they were.
Giant rock
has
split in half. Now, there's a big story about that, and I just want to get your take. Do you buy into the issue that rock split on the very day that indigenous peoples predicted long ago? Is that true?
I don't know that that's true.
Because when it did split, it was almost immediately that this whole yarn came out about how Native Americans or Native peoples did predict this long ago.
I mean, first of all, there was an earthquake, right?
Yeah.
And it was quite a temblor. And it had enough force to find some weak spot. And and just sever off a part of it. And so I don't know that this particular event was in some kind of Native American prophecy or not.
Well, there was some claims that it was. I don't know either. We did run some stories about it. All right, there's our first segment in the books already. Bill Hamilton and I will come right back with Michael Tanner, who, along with Bill Hamilton, did the bulk of the early research into the Phoenix Lights. Boy, oh boy, Bill, that 1997?
Yeah,
since the year 2000. Hey, it does go fast. Be right back, folks. Don't go away. March 13th, 1997, you folks in the Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona, and other parts of Arizona certainly remember that night, even if you didn't see anything. It will go down in history as maybe one of the most famous days in Phoenix area. Well, contemporary history at least. Bill Hamilton, you worked with Michael Tanner on this. You want to go ahead and introduce Michael? He's on the phone now.
Oh, good, because Michael and I kind of worked together. Actually, Michael probably did the most investigative work on the Phoenix Lights of anyone that I know of. And he
that's saying a lot.
Well, yeah. And he did an excellent job of organizing the data, and I suggested to him that we classify it according to events that occurred, because there were several events that the public seems to be largely unaware of that occurred on that particular night.
Right. Michael, welcome to the program.
Glad to be a part of it. Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the introduction.
What's your background, Michael, in terms of this whole UFO arena? Have you been interested in it for a long time?
Well, it goes back to, I can remember 8 years old, going by myself with my mother's permission on the bus to downtown Albuquerque and seeing, I think, the first documentary ever produced. It had the classic Tremonton, Utah footage and the Four Corners footage in it. And
this is in a movie theater?
This was in a movie theater.
On the big screen?
On the big screen in 1954.
Yeah, that must have made an impression on you.
It definitely did. I felt there was a definite reality to it, and I was deeply impressed, but it was kind of odd that the interest sort of went away for a number of years. I realized later we moved to California, ironically, about, I'd say, 10, 12 miles from Giant Rock. I was aware of the place, but not what was going on there at the time, and I had... in retrospect, later realized I had 2 or 3 sightings there and didn't know what I was watching.
Interesting. You know, just a thought about movie theater screens. When we watch UFO documentaries on the small screen, the video screen at home, it does not have the impact. When you see something in the big theater setting, it just has a whole different dimension.
Yes, certainly does. And it wasn't until college that the subject crossed my mind again, and I thought about delving into it and realizing that people from my religious background, although they would allow for the possibility, never really talked about it, and I thought that wasn't the right path. We should explore the truth and match the truth to what we believed in, and so on. But
gee, a novel idea there. Let's see if it sells. We'll try it.
But I kind of backed into it in the 1978. I was doing some multimedia production with Jim Delatoso, you probably know of.
Oh, sure.
It was at that point he was asked to join into the Meyer case investigation and come up with a way to analyze the photographs and film that Billy Meyer had come up with. And he asked me to join the the activity with them, I got acquainted with the investigators, Wendell Stevens and Lee Elders and Britt and Tom Welch, and also Jim Lorenzen, who was one of the co-founders with his wife of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization in Tucson. So I was able to jump in with both feet and totally get immersed in all the data that Jim had made available to us, as well as put the Meyer case evidence into context. And as those folks kind of warned us before we got really into it, that we were going to start seeing things and experiencing things, and sure enough, that began to happen. So I can tell you, despite all the controversy that's been enshrouded in the Meyer case, and I think there's been good reason to call into question some of the things that Meyer claimed later on, I can tell you certainly that in the early stages of the case, his contacts and encounters were very real indeed.
That's pretty much the way it seems to me after watching this for a number of years, not as closely as you perhaps, but I've talked to enough people who suggest the same thing, that there certainly were powerful reasons to believe him in terms of the early days, but then things got a little sketchy later on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it left a lasting impression. I didn't stay active in the field per se after a year or so, intensely involved in it and witnessing a number of things with Jim and the others. But everything that I experienced stayed with me, where I was continually pondering the questions and questioning what I had witnessed myself, as well as accepting things at face value and trying to make sense of a gigantic puzzle that was really beginning to emerge. But with dedication, I think Bill will tell you, and keeping a focus, things begin to take shape, and although they may get more complex, you begin to make a sense of it all.
Right, understand. Okay, we're coming up on our break. When we come back, we've got a couple segments. We're going to do a little summary of where we are 6 years later after the Phoenix Lights, March 13th. We got it right on the very day.
Exactly.
I don't know how that happened. That Bill Hamilton manipulating again, that's what it was.
Yeah.
How many hours do you think you might have put into this investigation, Michael? Any guess?
Well, it's in the hundreds, I can tell you that.
Sure.
I was dealing with combining what the reports that came into the Seattle Center, Peter Davenport's good work, and thankfully one of our council people here, Francis Barwood, got into the fray quite innocently, but that triggered probably another 400 or 500 calls and reports to her, and with her cooperation, our centering the investigation of Village Labs, we had access to all of that data.
Wow, she really came through, didn't she?
Absolutely.
And paid the price for it, too, pathetically. What a sad commentary on American politics. Be right back in just a couple of minutes with Bill Hamilton and Michael Tanner. Okay, and we're back. Bill Hamilton, Michael Tanner, along with me as we look back 6 years ago at the Phoenix Lights events, plural. Bill, all right, tell us what we've learned in these years and what's new, and then we'll go to Michael.
Well, one of the things that we learned, and it's something that I would like Michael to talk about, is before the entire night parade of lights and very large structured objects started from the very northwest corner of Arizona and moved in a kind of a southeast pattern until it took them over the Valley of the Sun, over various cities around Phoenix as well as Phoenix itself. There were even sightings earlier, even during the waning daylight hours. And some of these sightings that occurred up north, Michael knows more about than anyone else because he was in a position to interview some of the witnesses. And there was a very strange event that occurred around the Crown King area, right off of Highway 17, which is the highway that comes down from Flagstaff into Phoenix.
Michael, let's go to you and tell us about that Highway 17 event.
Well, this is one of 3 calls that I got to Village Labs as a result of the USA Today article that appeared some months after the event. It, on its cover, featured, I guess to draw the readers into the feature article, an illustration done by one of the close encounter witnesses, Tim Lee, of the V craft with the 5 lights and the saguaro cactus in the foreground. People reacted to that as they saw something familiar. The people in Glendale that first call said, we saw 3 of those hovering over Crown King when we were on our way back from Flagstaff down Interstate 17. And they were so curious to see such obviously very large objects that they pulled over into a rest area just about 15 miles away from Crown King, roughly. Mm-hmm. They pulled over to watch what was going on or what in the world were these huge things. And they likened them to big bluebirds without the body, just the wings, and specifically looked like this, as Tim Lee called it, a carpenter's square, not quite a chevron. The ends were perpendicular. Uh-huh. But as a carpenter's square, picture 3 of those hovering, aiming to the west in a loose formation. All of a sudden, a bright amber light, and that color is significant because that's the color later, the Phoenix lights so-called, were videotaped at around 10 o'clock, including Bill and Tom King there. But this amber light appeared and burned momentarily. It began to diminish and morphed, if you will, into a dark shape, which they said was either triangular or square. They couldn't tell quite if it had 4 corners or 3. And this now 4th object was hovering with the first 3. And then the next thing, all of a sudden, they went into a vertical formation, and they began to collapse upon each other, as they described, rolled into like a ball, and all of a sudden just winked out and disappeared.
These huge things?
Yes. And within a second or 2, they saw 2 jets coming up low from the south, obviously from Luke Air Force Base, which has line-of-sight vision or view of Crown King, attempting to intercept these objects, finding nothing there, did a big sweep and went back to the base. Now, the 2 other calls I mentioned, the next one came from Las Vegas, reacting again to that same illustration produced by Tim. And the Las Vegas witnesses said, we were on Lake Mead at about 3 o'clock on the afternoon of March 13th. The Crown King event was at about 5:30. So 2 or 3 hours earlier, they said we saw 8 of these directly overhead. They estimated about 10,000 feet. And as this airliner was crossing their flight path over Las Vegas area at about 20,000 feet, they estimated, it seemed to trigger a response where these 8 objects went into a similar routine of rolling into each other, compressing, and disappearing.
How strange.
The 3rd call came from a town outside or near the Kennedy Airport. A mother and daughter and some family members were out in their front yard looking at hail bop, and all of a sudden they noticed 2 V formations of light headed in their direction. The lights went off. Then they could see the 2 objects were these carpenter square-like craft. They could see the silhouettes, but appeared like they were going to crash into each other, but they didn't crash. They appeared to merge, apparently. Lights come back on. It's a single object. the object goes into a tumbling and twirling motion and ultimately just disappears right before their eyes.
I haven't heard these accounts before. That is utterly bizarre. Now, when these objects were described to have merged, what are we to think? That they all got into a very tight formation, or are you suggesting, or did the eyewitnesses suggest that they actually became one piece of what looked like hardware instead of multiples?
Merged into one object. Let me jump back to the Phoenix lights. At about 8:45 on the night of March 13th, we have the first of 4 truck drivers coming up I-10 from the direction of Tucson toward Phoenix and approaching a local landmark called Picacho Peak. His first driver is seeing what appears to be what he said 2 747s coming in for a landing at the nearby airliner graveyard, Evergreen Aviation there. And it looked like they were side by side, they were going to crash into each other. Then the next thing he realized that they were stopped and actually had become one object. He was driving toward this position. He got close. The craft was about a quarter mile off the highway. He radioed back to his buddies, who were each about 5 minutes from each other behind him. And all 4 of them saw this craft now merged into one, hover in this same position, all the while they drove past it on their way to Phoenix.
Wow. All right, we have to pause. Did at any time the object look like a 747, or was that just something he assumed was going on because of the size of it?
It's just the size and the lights. As soon as he got to anywhere close, he could see this was no 747 or a pair of them. This is something else altogether. And the first witness has a very deep testimony, if you will, of this craft was from another world. There's no question about it. And anybody who makes a claim that this is some kind of black ops object is a lunatic.
Or seriously mistaken.
That's seriously mistaken.
All right, let's give him some room there. All right. We'll pause and come right back in just a few minutes. About 3 of them, I believe, with Bill Hamilton and Michael Tanner. Back. I remember having one of the truck driver witnesses on the program. That was a remarkable encounter. Bill Hamilton, one of many strange objects that were seen all over the place in that time frame.
Yes, and Jeff, as I have been thinking about this, one of the sightings that really impressed me were the many witnesses that described this huge triangle. And by huge, I'm talking about all estimates placed the span of the triangle at close to 2 miles.
Independence Day.
And, absolutely. And it was moving on the east side of the valley, coming down over Scottsdale and Mesa, Chandler, and was seen as far south as Casa Grande.
Now, this wasn't a Carpenter Square or a chevron shape.
No,
this was a triangle.
This was a triangle whose solid surface was reflecting the ground lights. It was low enough to reflect ground lights. And people described seeing rectangular-looking panels on the bottom of this object. But on the leading edge on each side of the triangle were what we describe as these amber lights. And one witness described one of these amber lights detaching itself from the triangle and moving westward out over the city, and then seeing as the triangle was moving south, this same light returning and attaching itself to the side of the object again. Now imagine, if you will, that from these high strangeness cases where we're seeing a light appear and an object just emerge from this, a very large object, and then shrink down into a light again and disappear. We're talking about something that appears to have a multi-dimensional reality. So it's very possible that either these lights are acting as some kind of a gate mechanism whereby the objects can emerge from the light, or somehow they're embedded in higher dimensions within the light. And we call these lights orbs. They're the same as what we had videotaped at around 10 o'clock that night. I first saw one that appeared to be a double light at about 10 minutes to 10 on that very night, and they were seen on 2 previous nights. So we know they were like scouts, scouting the area, and then suddenly emerging from these orbs and traveling as very large carpenter square-like objects across Phoenix skies. So it appears that somebody took an interest in doing this on that one particular day, and that remains a mystery to me as to why it happened on that day and hasn't happened in since then in quite that way. But we have seen reports of singular objects that are very similar from around the world.
I just can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to look up and see something that big, that low, overhead.
Well, Tim Lee saw it pretty low from standing in front of his house.
Yeah, well, we had him on, I think, with when Peter put his show together on that. I remember the description.
Yeah, and with Tim's, what they witnessed, the visible part of it, so to say, the Carpenter Square part was probably 600, 700 feet on each arm. They related that there was really a much larger part of the craft, or a craft too attached possibly, that was being cloaked somehow. And seen from the side a little bit later in its path through the valley, was seen to be a mile long, at least by several witnesses.
I think we have to accept the rather simple and pragmatic fact that these people coming here have obviously mastered the art of what we would call invisibility, or as Michael said, cloaking. I mean, it's no big deal. I suggest, and I'm sure you gentlemen would probably agree, that craft like these are probably very common above our skies and the skies of other nations and countries on this planet, but they're just not seen. Now, we do know there are alleged electromagnetic pulse meters called UFO detectors, which pick up all sorts of things moving the magnetic flux around as they pass overhead. And I think that it's probably a lot busier up there than we can see with the naked eye. Would you agree, Bill?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Certainly with what we saw with this singular incident, with all the events, there were fully 5 enormous craft that came through the valley from the west side of Glendale to the east side Mesa, and the craft that went over the Lees seemed to be the center point, so to say. It came in low and zigzagged through the valley. In fact, it even came over the Village Labs building when Bill and I and Tom and the others were meeting up with Dr. Stephen Greer, who had just shown up to bring tapes for us to help in the editing process. But on either side of that chevron, or Carpenter Square, we had at high altitude an enormous boomerang that went over the east or west valley at about 19,000 feet after first being at rooftop level in Prescott, to another triangle over I-17, which was one of the military jet interception events as well. Then on the other side of the Carpenter Square was this measurably 2 miles wide, 3 miles long triangle that first appeared in North Scottsdale and later went over I-17 or I-10 rather, when a family was driving under it, Bill, and you'll recall our interview with Stacy Rhodes and her family.
Oh, yes.
And her vivid description of them driving under this craft. They were going the opposite direction, and they kept going at 80 miles an hour, and it took them 1 to 2 minutes to go clear under it. Remember when we asked her, since they lived near the Air Force Base in Tucson, compared to a C-5A Galaxy, how large was this? And she laughed and said, this thing was so big a C-5A could have landed on it.
That's too big. It doesn't compute in my head. I mean, I would just probably turn into the grass or whatever else I was standing on if I looked up and saw something like that.
Well, there was no question with all the data added up that this was a very, very calculated, orchestrated demonstration of some kind, and designed to get a response from the government through the military. We've got 6 sets of witnesses seeing various attempts of interception and so on.
Do we have anyone who saw jets in close proximity to any of these objects when they were visible?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I mean, you see an object, you see a jet flying around it, that kind of thing?
Well, the first witness to come out early on was Bill Greiner, the truck driver.
Bill was on the program.
Right, and he ended up in his 2-hour drive to a materials yard, dumping his materials there about a mile from Luke. And these 2 orbs that he first sighted on his way down I-17 seemed to be pacing ahead of him, such that they waited and hovered for him to arrive where he did, and he was in a position to see 2 jets, then a third one come blasting out of Luke, afterburners on, did a steep arc over his head, apparently trying to intercept this orb, and they got right on top of it, and it shot straight up and went out of sight so fast as if it disappeared. Then the other accounts slowly began to surface. Other people in the middle of the city and North Scottsdale and elsewhere seeing jets come very close and almost collide with one triangle in one instance at about 9:30.
Wow, and the military continues to stonewall this, huh, Bill? Nothing's changed.
The personnel or the PR person from Luke Air Force Base came out and made a definite statement just a few days after the event.
Yeah, it was a woman officer, and I remember.
Right.
Yeah.
That no aircraft from Luke were out there flying at night because they didn't. It was a training base, and they didn't fly the F-16s at night. And I stationed myself a few days after that over by Luke, and I watched jets taking off at 9:30 at night and landing again.
Well, nothing new there. They've been lying for over 50 years now.
Well, one officer that happened to talk to a producer working on a special here, he went to a party and mutual friends such that here in the group assembled, and having his drinks, after a while he loosened up and he took this fellow outside and said, listen, I can't say much about this, but I can tell you that was the worst night of my military life at Luke. It was sheer pandemonium at the base.
Wow. Well, that pretty well sums it up. Thank you both for being here. Michael, thank you, and congratulations on some superior work on this case. And we all know it doesn't pay well, but you've made a major contribution.
Thanks very much. Appreciate being on.
My pleasure. And Bill Hamilton, they're on the Peter Davenport's National UFO Reporting Center homepage is an important case. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the disappearance of 2 U.S. Air Force officers when their jet, just flat F-89C, vanished over Lake Superior while chasing a disc.
Yeah, I remember that.
So, thanks, Bill. And your book on the Phoenix Lights still available through your website?
Still available, Amazon.com.
Excellent. Thanks, my friend. We'll talk sooner rather than later, I'm sure.
Okay, Jeff. Thank you.
Take care. Okay, there's a look back at just some of the highlights of, well, you figure it out, a staggering display of advanced technology in the hands of visitors 6 years ago already over Phoenix. We'll continue in just a few minutes.